Dad Cross leaned back in his captain's chair, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. The Vanguard was a fine ship, fast, sturdy, and equipped with some of the best technology humanity had to offer. But right now, none of that mattered. Something was wrong with the environmental controls. The temperature inside the ship had been rising for the past hour, creeping past comfortable levels, and settling into something more suited for a desert than a starship. The air had grown thick, humid, and oppressive. Dad had stripped down to just his undershirt, but it didn't help much. "Captain," the ship's AI, no VA, chimed in, her voice smooth but urgent. "Internal temperature has exceeded safe thresholds for most species on board. The cooling system has suffered a critical malfunction." Dad swore under his breath. This was bad. His human body could handle the heat for a while, but the alien diplomats on board, that was another story. A warning light blinked on the main console, signaling an incoming transmission from the passenger quarters. With a sigh, Dad pressed the button, and the screen flickered to life. Vena, the Xilari ambassador, appeared first. Her violet skin had taken on a paler hue, and the glowing bioluminescent patterns on her arms pulsed erratically, a clear sign of distress in her species. Her usually composed expression was strained, beads of sweat visible on her forehead. "Captain," she said, her voice tight, "this temperature is unbearable for my people. How soon can this be fixed?" Behind her, Dant could see the silver-haired Tarivian warrior, Risa, pacing restlessly. Unlike Vena, whose species was accustomed to cold oceanic worlds, Risa's kind came from a tundra-covered planet. Her skin, normally a pale silver, was flushed, and she had abandoned the heavy ceremonial cloak she always wore, leaving her in a form-fitting bodysuit. Further back, Elira, the soft-spoken Kithuri scientist, sat with her back against the wall, fanning herself weakly with a datapad. Her blue skin looked slick with sweat, and her long, fin-like ears twitched in discomfort. Dant rubbed his temples. "This is going to be a long day." "I'm working on it," he said. "The cooling system is down, and we'll need to fix it manually. Until then, I suggest." A sudden crackle interrupted him as the ship's power flickered. The hum of the ventilation system stuttered, then died completely. A moment of silence followed. Then Vena's voice, much sharper now. "Captain, what just happened?" Dant checked the diagnostics and groaned. The last of the backup cooling just failed. He exhaled slowly. The temperature's only going to get worse. Risa growled, baring sharp teeth. "This ship is supposed to be top-tier human engineering, and it can't even keep the heat down." Dant shot her a look. "Unless you know how to fix an atmospheric regulator, I suggest you let me handle it." Risa scowled but said nothing. Vena sighed, rubbing her temples. "What do you suggest, Captain?" Dant hesitated. They were running out of options. If they didn't cool down soon, things could get dangerous. Heat exhaustion, dehydration, even unconsciousness for the more vulnerable species. "There's one thing that might help," he said finally. "It's not ideal, but it'll keep you from overheating." Elira looked up, blinking slowly. "What is it?" Dant exhaled. "You need to remove any unnecessary clothing. Your bodies are trapping too much heat." A long pause. Then, "Excuse me." Vena's usually smooth, diplomatic voice had a sharp edge to it. Risa folded her arms, raising an eyebrow. "You're joking." "I'm not," Dant said. "It's simple thermoregulation. Less insulation means your body can cool down faster." Vena exchanged glances with the others. Elira looked uncomfortable but thoughtful, while Risa muttered something under her breath. "We don't do that," Vena said carefully. "At least, not in front of others." Dant ran a hand through his hair, trying not to let frustration show. "I get it. But right now, modesty is the least of your worries. If we don't fix the cooling system soon, this ship is going to turn into an oven. And I don't know about you, but I'd rather be alive and embarrassed than cooked." Another silence followed. Then, finally, Vena sighed, rubbing her temple. This is deeply uncomfortable. Dant shrugged. Not as uncomfortable as passing out from heat stroke. The Lyra shifted. If this is truly necessary. She hesitated, then nodded. We do what must be done. Risa groaned. I hate this. Dant smirked. Welcome to human problem solving. Little did he know, this was only the beginning of a much bigger problem. Dant Cross wiped the sweat from his brow as he leaned against the control panel, frustration gnawing at him. The ship's AC was still offline, and the temperature had risen another few degrees. The air was stifling, heavy with humidity, and his passengers, 3 alien women from vastly different worlds, were not handling it well. Vena, the Xilari diplomat, was struggling the most. Her violet skin, usually radiant with bioluminescent markings, had turned almost dull. The ocean-dwelling species wasn't made for extreme heat, and even with her robe loosened, she looked dangerously exhausted. Lyra, the Kithari scientist, sat on the floor with her back against the bulkhead, her normally soft and composed expression now showing clear discomfort. Her delicate fin-like ears twitched every so often as she fanned herself with a data pad, but it was barely helping. And then there was Risa, the Tarivian warrior. Unlike the others, she refused to show weakness, but the way she kept shifting, tugging at the collar of her bodysuit, was proof enough that the heat was getting to her too. Dant knew he had to fix this fast. All right, he said, rolling up his sleeves. I need to get to the cooling system's main panel, but it's down in the lower deck. With the power failures, some sections of the ship are running on emergency backup, meaning there might not be enough air circulation down there. Vena exhaled shakily. Meaning it's going to be even hotter. Risa groaned. Great, just great. Lyra looked at him with tired eyes. Do you require assistance? Dant considered it. Normally, I'd say no, but with the way things are going, I might need an extra pair of hands. He glanced at the 3 of them. But you're all struggling already. I don't want to make things worse. Vena shook her head. If it means fixing this, I will help. Dant sighed. He knew pride wouldn't let them sit still while he did all the work. Fine. But first, he gave them a pointed look. I meant what I said earlier. You need to cool down. That means. Risa groaned. Yes, we know. Less clothing. Vena crossed her arms, still visibly uneasy. This is highly improper among my people. Dant smirked. I'm not asking you to throw a party in your underwear. Just remove anything heavy, like layers or thick fabric. It'll help. The 3 women exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable. But after a few seconds, Vena let out a tired sigh. If it is necessary, then so be it. With clear reluctance, she undid the high collar of her ceremonial robe, slipping it off her shoulders. The fabric pooled at her feet, leaving her in a much lighter, sleeveless tunic. Her bioluminescent markings pulsed faintly, reacting to the change in temperature. The Lyra followed next, removing her outer coat and folding it neatly beside her. The Kithari's slim, toned frame was now visible under a sleeveless jumpsuit, and her delicate fins on the sides of her face twitched slightly at the sudden relief. Risa, predictably, was the last to move. She grumbled something under her breath before yanking off the upper half of her bodysuit, tying it around her waist. Underneath, she wore a close-fitting tank top, her strong, defined arms glistening with sweat. Dante took a deep breath. Focus, man. Focus. See. Not so bad, he said, turning toward the access hatch. Now let's get moving before we all pass out. The group made their way toward the lower decks, the heat thickening with every step. By the time they reached the maintenance hatch, it felt like they were walking through a furnace. Dant pried open the control panel, checking the system diagnostics. Dan, the cooling regulator was fried, and the emergency backup was barely holding. This is worse than I thought, he muttered. Vena wiped her brow. Can it be repaired? Dant nodded. Yeah, but I need to bypass some circuits. It's going to take time. Risa cracked her knuckles. Then hurry up, because I swear, if I pass out from this heat, I'm blaming you. Dant chuckled, pulling out his tools. Noted. But just as he started working, a low rumble vibrated through the ship. The Lyra's ears perked up. Did you hear that? Before anyone could react, the ship lurched, a sudden violent motion that sent them tumbling across the overheated room. Dant barely managed to grab onto the control panel as a sharp warning alert blared through the speakers. Novie's voice crackled over the comms. Warning. Unidentified external force detected. Possible impact. Initiating emergency protocols. Dant's stomach dropped. What the hell was that? The heat problem had just become the least of their concerns. Dant barely had time to react before the ship lurched again, nearly knocking him off his feet. The warning alarms blared, and Nenovie's mechanical voice rang out through the speakers. Hull integrity compromised. Unidentified impact detected. Scanning for threats. What now? Risa growled, steadying herself against the bulkhead. Sweat dripped down her forehead. But her focus had sharpened. She was a warrior, and this sudden danger had pushed aside her discomfort. Elira pulled herself up, her violet eyes scanning the control panel. The ship's sensors are detecting anomalous movement outside. She tapped the screen. Something, or someone is approaching. Dant felt his stomach tighten. They were in deep space, stranded with a failing AC system, and now something was heading their way. It was the worst kind of luck. Vena, still trying to cool herself by dabbing a damp cloth against her neck, frowned. Is it possible that another ship has found us? Dant shook his head. If it were a friendly ship, they'd be hailing us. And I don't like how sudden this is. Just then, a loud metallic thud echoed through the ship, like something had latched onto the hull. The room fell silent. Then came a second thud. Risa immediately pulled a combat knife from her belt. We're being boarded. Vena's markings flickered in alarm. Who would board a damaged ship in the middle of nowhere? Dant's fingers flew across the panel, trying to pull up external cameras. The heat was unbearable, but he pushed through it. His shirt clung to his back, his hands slick with sweat. Finally, the screen flickered to life, and what he saw made his blood run cold. 6 dark, insectoid figures were crawling along the ship's outer hull, their sharp limbs digging into the metal plating. Their elongated heads twitched as they moved, and their glowing yellow eyes locked onto the ship's airlock. Dant's voice came out as a whisper. Void Reapers. Elira inhaled sharply. Impossible. They don't usually operate this far out. Tell that to the ones about to tear their way in, Dant muttered. Void Reapers, merciless scavengers, known for attacking stranded vessels and stripping them clean. They didn't just take parts. They took bodies too. If they got inside, Dante and the others wouldn't just lose their ship. They'd never be seen again. We need a plan, Risa said, gripping her knife tighter. Dant nodded. First, we have to stop them from cutting through the airlock. He turned back to the control panel and started rerouting power. If he could trigger a localized shock pulse through the outer hull, it might stun the creatures long enough for them to fight back. But there was a problem. The power systems are still unstable, he muttered. I can activate a pulse, but it's going to drain more energy. And that means even less cooling. Vena looked at the screen, her bioluminescent markings glowing in distress. So we choose, either suffer through worse heat, or let them in. Dante took a deep breath. There's no choice. If they get in, we're dead. He hit the activation switch. Outside, the hull crackled with blue energy. The Void Reapers screeched as the electric pulse rippled through their bodies, their sharp limbs spasming. 2 of them lost their grip and tumbled into the void, while the others scurried back, twitching from the shock. Risa grinned. That bought us time. But before anyone could celebrate, the ship suddenly shuddered again, this time from a new problem. Elira gasped. The energy drain. It's caused a full system shutdown. The emergency lights flickered out, and a wave of suffocating heat rushed in. The AC was completely dead now. The temperature was already unbearable, but now it would only get worse. Dante wiped his forehead. Fantastic. They had driven off the Void Reapers, for now. But if they didn't fix the ship soon, they wouldn't need Reapers to finish them off. The heat would do it for them. The moment the power died, the ship became a furnace. The air was already thick and suffocating, but now it felt like a sealed oven, trapping every bit of heat inside. Dante gritted his teeth, feeling sweat drip down his back. The emergency lights flickered, barely illuminating the tense faces around him. "Systems are down," Elira said, her voice tight. "That was our last pulse. If the Reapers come back, we have nothing left to stop them." Dante slammed a fist against the console. "And we're cooking alive in here." Vena wiped her forehead, her bioluminescent markings dull from exhaustion. "If we don't find a way to restart the cooling soon, our bodies will shut down." She looked at Risa, who stood with arms crossed, her breathing slow but deliberate. Even the warrior, built for extreme conditions, was reaching her limit. Dante knew they had minutes, not hours. "There's a backup power relay in the lower deck," he said, trying to think. "It's separate from the main core. If we can kickstart it, we might get basic systems running again, including cooling." Risa nodded. "Then what are we waiting for?" They moved fast. The corridor leading to the lower deck was dimly lit, the walls lined with exposed wires where panels had been ripped out. The ship was old, and the recent surge had fried half its circuits. As they passed a vent, a sudden hissing noise made them freeze. Dante raised his hand for silence. The sound was faint but unmistakable, claws scraping against metal. Elira's eyes widened. "They're still out there." Risa slowly pulled her knife, her muscles tensing. "Then we better hurry." They reached the access hatch to the lower deck. Dante pried it open, and a wave of heat blasted up, even hotter than before. He clenched his jaw. If the upper levels were a furnace, the lower deck was hell itself. "I'll go first," he said. "No," Vena stepped forward. "My body regulates heat better than yours. I'll go." Dante wanted to argue, but there was no time. He handed her a toolkit. "Find the power relay. There should be a manual override switch. Flip it and get out fast." Vena nodded and climbed down. The heat shimmered around her as she disappeared into the darkness below. Seconds stretched into minutes. Risa stood guard at the hatch, knife ready. "She's taking too long." Dante wiped his forehead. "She'll do it." But then, a scream. Without thinking, Dante dove into the hatch, ignoring the blast of heat that hit him like a wall of fire. The lower deck was a maze of pipes and glowing red metal, steam hissing from cracks in the walls. "Vena," he called out. A choked gasp answered him. He turned a corner and saw her, collapsed near the relay panel, her limbs trembling. She was overheating. Dante rushed to her side. Her breathing was shallow, her markings flickering weakly. "I found it," she whispered, motioning toward the relay. "But I can't move." Dante gritted his teeth. He couldn't lose her. Without hesitation, he grabbed the relay switch and pulled. For a second, nothing happened. Then, a low hum rumbled through the ship. Lights flickered back to life. The cooling system stuttered, then roared to life with a blast of cool air. Dante scooped Vena up and staggered toward the ladder. Above, Risa and Elira pulled them both out. The relief was instant, cool air brushing against their sweat-drenched skin. Vena coughed, taking a deep breath. That was close. Dante exhaled. Too close. But before they could celebrate, the ship shook again. The Void Reapers were back. And this time, they were coming in full force. The moment the ship trembled, Dante knew they were out of time. The Void Reapers had found them again. Vena was still catching her breath from the heat exhaustion, her bioluminescent markings faint but steady. Rissa stood near the main corridor, her knife gripped tightly, her eyes sharp and calculating. Elira was already at the controls, scanning the ship's exterior. "They're landing on the hull," Elira said, voice tense. "At least 4, no 5 of them. And they're cutting through." Dant swore under his breath. The Void Reapers weren't just scavengers. They were hunters, and now they smelled weakness. "We can't let them in," Rissa said. "We fight them here, or we die." Dant nodded. "All right. We hold them at the breach point." Vena pushed herself up. "Give me a weapon." "You should rest." Dant started, but she cut him off with a glare. "I fight," she said. He didn't argue. Instead, he tossed her a pulse pistol and checked his own weapon. The ship was still running on emergency power, which meant the main weapons were offline. That left them with close combat, and whatever guns they had left. The first impact shook the corridor. A loud screeching sound filled the air as the Reapers clawed through the hull. Sparks rained down as their jagged, blackened talons ripped through the metal like paper. Then, silence. Dant aimed his rifle at the breach. His finger tightened on the trigger. A single clawed hand burst through the hole, gripping the metal edge. Then another. Then a third. They were inside. The first Void Reaper crawled through, tall, thin, and grotesque, its skeletal frame covered in armor-like plates, its mouth split open, revealing rows of jagged teeth, black saliva dripping. Its empty white eyes locked onto Dante. Bang! Dant fired first, the blast tearing through its chest. The Reaper's shrieks, flailing as it collapsed. But behind it, more came. Rissa moved fast. She lunged forward, her blade flashing, severing a Reaper's limb before spinning and driving the knife into its throat. It let out a horrific gurgling sound before dropping. Elira was already firing, her energy shots burning holes into their attackers. 3 down, 2 to go. The next one leaped at Vena. She dodged, barely, then fired a wild shot. It missed. Dant didn't hesitate. He grabbed the creature midair, using its own momentum to slam it into the wall. It screeched, claws slashing wildly, tearing through his sleeve and cutting deep into his arm. Pain exploded through Dante, but he didn't stop. He drew his combat knife and drove it straight into the creature's skull. The last Reaper hesitated. It saw its fallen kin, its mandibles clicking, calculating its next move. Then, it lunged. Before anyone could react, a shot rang out. The Reaper's head snapped back, a gaping hole where its face used to be. Vena stood there, panting, her pistol still aimed. Her hand shook, but her expression was firm. Silence filled the room. Dant clutched his bleeding arm. "We need to move. This was just a scout team. The real force is coming." Elira checked the scanners, her face pale. "He's right. There's a whole fleet inbound." Dant exhaled. "Then we're not fighting anymore." Rissa narrowed her eyes. "Then what?" Dant looked at the ship's navigation panel. There was only one option left. "We run." Dant gritted his teeth as he gripped the control panel, his injured arm burning with pain. The ship's alarms blared loudly, flashing red lights illuminating the darkened interior. The Void Reaper fleet was closing in fast. They had no time. Elira's fingers danced over the controls. "They've already locked onto us. If we don't jump now, we're dead." "I know." Dant cut her off, forcing his mind to focus. The ship lurched violently as an explosion rocked the hull. Sparks rained down from the ceiling. "They're firing on us," Rissa shouted, bracing herself against the wall. "Shields are at 20%. One more hit, and we're done." Vena stumbled but kept her balance, her glowing eyes flicking toward Dante. "We need an escape route." Dant's mind raced. The hyperdrive wasn't fully charged, but they didn't have a choice. They had to risk it. "Elira, override the safety protocols. We're jumping now." Elira's eyes widened. "That could tear us apart." Dant didn't hesitate. It's that or the Reapers tear us apart instead. Elira swallowed hard but nodded. Her hands flew across the panel. The hyperdrive whined, struggling to power up. Vena glanced at the screen, her expression grim. They're closing in. Fast. Dant's pulse pounded in his ears. His human instincts screamed for survival, for action. Humans didn't go down without a fight. The ship shuddered as another explosion hit the rear engines. The lights flickered. Hold on, Elira shouted. Engaging hyperjump in 3, 2, 1. Boom. The ship vanished into hyperspace, leaving the Reapers behind. For a moment, there was only silence. The crew held their breath, waiting, hoping. Then, they were still alive. Dante exhaled, leaning against the control panel, sweat dripping from his brow. Did it work? Elira scanned the readings. We're alive. She let out a breathless laugh. The jump was rough, but we made it. Risa slumped into a chair, rubbing her temples. We shouldn't be alive. Vena sat down carefully, exhaustion clear in her features. But we are. Dant checked the ship's status. The engines were damaged, the shields were barely holding, and half their systems were fried. But they had escaped. For now. Elira frowned at the readings. We jumped blind. I have no idea where we are. Dant's jaw tightened. Can you find out? She sighed. Give me a minute. Vena's gaze softened as she looked at Dant's arm, still bleeding. You're hurt. Dant shook his head. I'll live. She reached out, her fingers lightly brushing his wound. A faint golden glow pulsed from her fingertips, and the pain eased slightly. Dant's breath caught. What was that? A little gift from my kind, Vena murmured, exhaustion making her voice softer. It won't heal you completely, but it will help. Dant looked at her, something unspoken passing between them. Elira interrupted. I've got our location. She paused, her face growing pale. What is it? Rissa asked. Elira swallowed. We're on the edge of Reaper-controlled space. The room fell silent. Dant closed his eyes for a brief second. They weren't safe yet, not even close. But he wasn't about to give up. Not now. We keep moving, he said. We find a way out, no matter what. Vena, Risa, and Elira nodded. Because now, they were in this together. Dant stared at the star map flickering on the screen. Their ship had barely survived the blind hyperjump, and now they were deep in enemy territory. The Void Reapers weren't the kind of enemy that simply gave up. They would hunt them down until there was nothing left to chase. Elira's voice cut through the tense silence. We need a plan, and we need one fast. Her silver eyes darted between the damaged controls, frustration tightening her jaw. The engines are barely functional, and our shields won't survive another attack. Risa exhaled sharply. We could try hiding on a nearby planet, at least to make repairs. She tapped a few buttons, scanning the surrounding space. There's a small, uninhabited moon nearby. If we land there, we might buy ourselves time. Dant rubbed his temple. It was a risk, but at this point, everything was a risk. Do it. Set a course. The ship trembled as Elira adjusted their trajectory. Sparks still flickered from the damaged systems, and the air smelled like burnt circuits. Every breath felt heavy. Every second weighed down by the knowledge that the Reapers would find them soon. Vena sat quietly, deep in thought. Her glowing eyes flickered with worry. The Reapers won't stop until they have what they want. Dant shot her a look. And what exactly do they want? Vena hesitated before answering. Me. Silence filled the cockpit. Dant clenched his fists. Why? Vena finally met his gaze. Because of my abilities. My people are one of the few species that can manipulate energy in ways the Reapers can't. They want me to power their war machines, to use me as a weapon. Her voice hardened. I won't let them. Dant exhaled slowly. He had suspected something like this. The Reapers weren't after their ship or their cargo. They were after her. Risa tightened her grip on her blaster. Then we make sure they don't get you. The ship rumbled as they entered the moon's atmosphere. It was a barren wasteland of jagged rock and swirling dust storms, a perfect place to hide, if they weren't already being tracked. The moment they landed, Dante jumped to his feet. Elira, Risa. It started on the repairs. Vena, come with me. We need to scout the area. Vena nodded and followed him down the ramp, the dry wind whipping against their faces. The moon was silent, eerily so. Dante's instincts screamed at him. Something was wrong. They moved carefully through the rocky terrain, their footsteps barely making the sound. The sky above them was dark, the stars hidden behind swirling dust clouds, a perfect place for an ambush. Dante's hand moved to his sidearm. Stay close. Vena nodded, her senses alert. She suddenly stopped, her eyes narrowing. They're here. Dante spun around just as a dark shape lunged from the shadows. He barely had time to react before a Reaper soldier tackled him to the ground, its claws inches from his throat. Vena thrust out her hands, and a pulse of golden energy blasted the Reaper backward. Dante rolled to his feet and fired, the shot hitting its mark. The creature screeched before collapsing into the dust. More shadows moved in the distance. They weren't alone. Dante grabbed Vena's wrist. Run. They sprinted back toward the ship as Reapers swarmed from the darkness, their glowing red eyes filled with hunger. Inside the ship, Elira and Risa were still working on the repairs when they heard the gunfire. Risa cursed. We've got company. Dante and Vena rushed up the ramp, panting. They found us, Dante growled. Elira's hands flew over the controls. We're not ready to take off yet. A loud bang echoed through the ship as something slammed against the hull. Vena turned to Dante, her eyes burning with determination. We fight. Dante loaded his weapon. Damn right we do. Dante gritted his teeth as another loud bang shook the ship. The Void Reapers were outside, their shadowy figures circling like vultures. The ship was grounded, barely functioning. They had nowhere to run. Risa pressed her back against the wall, gripping her blaster. We're surrounded. Elira's fingers flew over the controls, desperately trying to restart the engines. Just give me 2 minutes, she shouted. I can't work faster if you keep yelling at me. Dante's pulse pounded. 2 minutes might as well be 2 hours when Void Reapers were closing in. He turned to Vena, who stood near the entrance, her glowing eyes locked onto the creatures outside. They wanted her. They won't stop, she said quietly. They will tear this ship apart if they have to. Dante clenched his fists. He had known from the moment he saved her that she was important, but now, the weight of her existence pressed down on him. She wasn't just another passenger. She was the key to something much bigger. Another violent impact rocked the ship. The metal groaned, and sparks flew from the ceiling. They're trying to rip the hull open, Risa hissed. Dante's mind raced. They were trapped inside like rats in a cage. Unless we take the fight to them, he said. Risa raised an eyebrow. You want us to go out there, against them? Dante nodded. If we stay here, we're dead. We hit them hard and fast. Give Elira the time she needs. Vena stepped forward. I can help. Dante hesitated. He knew she had immense power, but using it drained her. If she pushed herself too far, she might not survive. Are you sure? He asked. Vena met his gaze. If we don't fight now, there won't be another chance. Dante exhaled. She was right. He turned to Risa. We take the high ground, stay mobile, and pick them off before they get close. We just need to hold them back for 2 minutes. Risa cracked a grin. I've fought with worse odds. Dante slapped the release button, and the ramp slammed down. The Void Reapers rushed forward instantly, their glowing red eyes burning through the dust-filled air. Their clawed hands reached for Vena. They wanted her alive. Dante fired first, his blaster lighting up the darkness. The shot hit the closest Reaper, sending it staggering back, but it didn't go down. These creatures were built to endure. Rissa was already moving, her shots fast and precise, hitting weak points in their armor. Vena stepped forward, raising her hands. The air around her hummed, and suddenly, a wave of golden energy burst from her fingertips. The nearest reapers screamed as the blast sent them flying. Dant's eyes widened. He had seen her power before, but never like this. She was stronger than he thought. More reapers came, undeterred by the fallen. They were endless. Dant reloaded his blaster. We need to hold. The fight was chaos. Shots flew, energy crackled, and the ground trembled from the force of the battle. Vena's power was a blazing storm, keeping the creatures at bay, but Dant could see the strain on her face. A reaper lunged at her, faster than the others. Dante moved without thinking. He threw himself between them, firing point blank into the creature's chest. It let out a horrible shriek and collapsed. Vena's breath hitched. Dant. I'm fine. He cut her off. Keep going. Then, a deafening roar filled the air. Dant turned and froze. A massive void reaper, nearly twice the size of the others, emerged from the darkness. Its armor was thicker, its claws dripped with venom, and its eyes burned like dying stars. It wasn't here to capture Vena. It was here to kill them all. Dant's grip tightened on his blaster. Elira, he shouted, tell me you're ready. Her voice crackled over the comms. 1 more minute. Dant exhaled. They didn't have a minute. Then we end this now, he muttered. He raised his weapon and charged. Dant charged forward, his blaster flaring with blue energy as he fired at the massive Void Reaper. The creature barely flinched, its thick armor absorbing the shots like they were nothing. Keep moving, Rissa shouted, rolling to the side and unleashing a rapid burst of fire at the smaller Reapers. She took down 2, but there were still too many. Vena's eyes glowed gold, and she raised her hands. A pulse of raw energy erupted from her, knocking back the creatures in a wide radius. The Reapers shrieked, their bodies disintegrating into dust under her power. But the large one, their leader, kept coming. Dant ducked as a clawed hand swung at him, barely missing his head. The air hummed with danger, and he could feel the heat of the monster's breath. Elira, we need that engine, he yelled into his comm. Almost there. Elira's frustrated voice crackled back. Not good enough. Rissa snapped, dodging another attack. The Void Reaper leader roared, and with one mighty swing, it sent Dant flying. He hit the ground hard, pain exploding in his ribs. His blaster skidded away across the rocky surface. Dante. Vena called out, rushing toward him. Stay back, he gritted, trying to push himself up. But it was too late. The creature had locked onto her now, its glowing red eyes fixed on Vena as it lurched forward, claws ready to strike. This was it. Dant's mind raced. He couldn't let this happen. He couldn't let them take her. Not after everything. With the last of his strength, he grabbed a shattered metal rod from the wreckage and hurled himself at the Reaper's back. He stabbed the jagged edge into the creature's spine, twisting it with all his might. The beast let out a monstrous screech, its body shuddering violently. It turned, slamming Dante to the ground with terrifying force. He gasped as pain ripped through him. Vena screamed his name. And then, her power exploded. A massive wave of golden energy erupted from her body, blindingly bright, crackling through the air like a living storm. The Void Reaper froze. For the first time, Dant saw fear in its glowing eyes. Vena raised her hands higher, her entire form surrounded by burning light. The energy surged, wrapping around the creature, lifting it into the air. The Reaper thrashed, shrieking in agony. Its body began to crumble, piece by piece, until nothing remained but dust. The battlefield fell silent. The remaining Void Reapers hesitated. Without their leader, they were uncertain, afraid. Rissa took advantage of their hesitation. She lifted her blaster. Run. The creatures flowed into the darkness, disappearing into the wasteland beyond. Dante lay on the ground, staring at the star-filled sky, trying to catch his breath. He was bruised, battered, and barely able to move, but they had won. Vena dropped to her knees beside him, her glowing eyes dim with exhaustion. "You idiot," she whispered. "You nearly died." Dante grinned weakly. Not the first time. She shook her head, her expression torn between relief and frustration. Then, without warning, she wrapped her arms around him, holding him tight. "Don't do that again," she murmured. Dante blinked. He could feel her warmth, the way her body trembled against his. For a moment, he forgot about the pain, the battle, the danger. Then Elira's voice broke the silence over the comm. "Engines are online," she cheered. "We can get out of here." Dante exhaled sharply. They had survived. But he knew this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning.